IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, Takshashila Institution's daily public policy podcast. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by my colleague Amit Kumar. Happy to have you here, Amit.
Thank you, Anushka. Thank you for having me.
Right. So I thought in this podcast episode, we could talk about your latest piece in The Hindu, Amit, on the recently unveiled Huawei mobile phone, the Mate 60, and the implications of the fact that it has 7 nanometer semiconductor chip attached into it. And of course, we know for a fact that there is an ongoing tension between the United States and China with regards to technological superiority, and semiconductors have really become a pawn in this contestation. And so when Huawei goes ahead and unveils this smartphone, which houses the Kirin 9000 processor, that is also houses the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation second generation chip, the 7 nanometer fabrication technique, it kind of looks like a snub to the US, in the sense that China is trying to tell the US that your sanctions haven't worked, and we are indeed possible of kind of achieving a breakthrough in an area that we haven't really shown capability in before. And this also happened alongside US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo's visit to Beijing. So the timing of Huawei's revelation has also been very appropriate. So in this context, Amit, let me come to you first and ask you, can you give our listeners a little bit of a background about this now very well-known, infamous phenomena that is the US-China technological contestation? And then maybe as we go further, we can talk about this quote-unquote breakthrough in specific and its implications for the contestation. Over to you, Amit.
Sure, Anushka. So, to understand the significance of the latest release of Huawei's new model of smartphone, you need to go back in time and somewhere around when the trade war began. So the trade war began somewhere around 2018, and as it progressed, it at the core of it, what it came out upfront was that the trade war was gonna be a tech war at its core, right? And things moved on, and when the tech war became so prominent, it became clearer and clearer that as we go ahead and observe this tech war contestation between the US and China, the chips or the advanced chips would be the one which would occupy the primary position, right? So we saw that the contestation was the contestation was very quite tough when it came to the chips and the advanced chips ecosystem. And therefore we saw last year we started seeing some credible developments on this front. It came first in the form of the CHIPS Act that the US released in August 2022. This was followed by the October 7 rules that imposed strict restrictions and sanctions on a slew of Chinese tech companies and its access to chips and as well as advanced lithography equipment that would go into making this entire chip ecosystem. And the idea was to deny China the level of sophistication that the US and its allies have achieved. And the idea here was to keep China at least 5 generations, or maybe 10 to 12 years, or 8 to 12 years, depending upon the level of development that you have achieved. So the idea was to keep Chinese at least 5 generations behind the most advanced systems that were in use in the US and the allied countries. And therefore, China had, during this time, China itself was progressing with its own self-sufficiency drive, wherein it wanted to become a self-sufficient, self-sufficient in producing some of these chips. So the case with China was that while advanced chips were out of its reach, it could not fabricate the advanced or design advanced chips. It had fair bit of experience in fabricating the lower end chips, or say chips that were in size that were bigger than the 14 nanometers. So up to 14 nanometers, China had some level of sophistication. But and recently, what has happened that Huawei, as you know, is one of the used to be one of the largest some smartphone giant, and used to have a large consumer base both within China and outside China. And it was the largest the smartphone company in the US with a significant chunk of the market share. But and for Huawei used to in its phone it used to employ or deploy TSMC made chips earlier. But after as the tech war progressed, uh, Huawei was sanctioned by the US, and it cut off its access to TSMC, that is Taiwan's leading fabrication fab company, which manufactures advanced chips, access to those chips made by TSMC. And what we saw was that in due course of time, as Huawei lost access to those advanced chips, its sale of smartphones or advanced smartphones got impacted. And the recent model, the Mate 60 Pro that the Huawei has launched. It is, I think, it has come out after a break of almost 2 years that the Huawei has launched a phone now. So after it lost access to TSMC's advanced chips, it had to turn to China's another semiconductor giant, SMIC, for its to get those chips. So SMIC is like TSMC, also a fabrication company, but the level of sophistication that the SMIC had achieved was way less than what the TSMC practices. But somewhere around 2020, SMIC was successful in achieving in demonstrating some level of sophistication in using or fabric or having a sophistication in 7 nanometer fabrication technology. But it was still not efficient, and what the recent Huawei model, the chipset that it uses, which is named Kirin 9000S, it houses a chip that was made using SMIC's second generation of 7 nanometer fabrication technology. So now this is what the buzz is all about. Huawei, through its with its model, has and with SMIC's help, has demonstrated that it can not rely on the US or the US tech ecosystem, and yet produce advanced or the 5G advanced mobiles, which have advanced chipsets included in them. So, and this has got the US business community and the strategic community worrying over the last few weeks. And we can, of course, discuss what are the implications and what this thing actually mean, what this technology demonstration actually means for the Chinese.
Right. Thanks, Amit. I think, of course, one of the points I would make with regards to how the trade war between the United States and China started out wasn't necessarily technological at its core, with a lot of the kind of tools of economic coercion and economic tactic used started out with very simple and basic things like aluminum and steel imports, so on and so forth. So its target was primarily trade, but over time, yes, it did snowball really fast into a contestation that became technological in nature, and now here we are. But what was interesting to me, apart from your brilliant insights on the history of this kind of development, was that Huawei did indeed demonstrate, and SMIC did indeed demonstrate its capability to produce a 7 nanometer chip 2 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago in 2020 itself. So, while the phone itself has indeed created a buzz, one can also likely look at the past developments and say that this is a development that was coming, or an announcement that was coming. But anyway, you mentioned that China relies an atmosphere or an ecosystem of self-sufficiency, and this quest to attain self-sufficiency in advancing chip manufacturing can become a messy business for China. It isn't necessarily sustainable for China. In this regard, and in the backdrop of what you said about the US-China contestation, before we come to the details of the lithography equipment used or SMIC's demonstrable capabilities, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what this difference in ecosystems is, and why exactly is China's quest for self sufficiency a little messy in this regard?
Yeah, sure. So what we have so far observed is that China itself, even before the tech sanctions started to come by from the US and its allies that we have seen lately, that have all kind of we have seen a lot of these sanctions come off lately. But even before these sanctions became a norm, China started pursuing its own self-sufficiency or drive for self-sufficiency in core technologies, and one could see the evidences of that in the most of the speeches by President Xi Jinping and the party communique, wherein the party has put it very clearly that they'll drive for self-sufficiency in core technologies, and advanced chips was one of them. So there are basic difference between both the US and the Chinese tech ecosystem, and because of China's own steps and the slew of sanctions that we have seen in the past, what we are currently seeing is that there'll be two separate ecosystem or tech ecosystems going further. There will be one that would be US led with partnerships from its allies and other partners such as Japan, Netherlands, UK, South Korea, Taiwan, and preferably India also. They also, countries like India, they have also with the US have signed a few agreements wherein the US or the American companies have promised to invest some of or help India set up some fab company in India. And plus, you also saw the ISET agreement that happened, and the slew of measures that were taken when Modi visited America. So this has created two separate ecosystems, wherein Chinese tech ecosystem is a highly isolated one, whereas the US has the support of a number of countries. Now, the fact that American ecosystem, or the US led ecosystem, encompasses the most advanced economies of the world, confers upon it several advantages that China's isolated system will find nearly impossible to compete with. And why I say that is because of three reasons, three broad reasons, right? So first, the extensive and distributed nature of the US-led tech ecosystem allows individual countries to achieve functional specialization, wherein and you see that when we look at the chip value chain itself, wherein the US specializes in design along with India, and the EDA, the control over the EDA tools. The Netherlands, you would see that they have complete almost complete domination over the lithography tools, with some share going to the Japanese. And mind you, with regard to the EUVs, which are the most advanced lithography tools, the Netherlands are the only Netherlands ASML are the only company making it. Then, if you come to very sophisticated materials that are used that go into making of advanced chips, Japan is the only country that specializes in those materials. And then, when it comes to fabrication, TSMC's uh, leadership in this sector is unparalleled. So you see how the US system is distributed. This is an advantage which China does not have. China, on the other hand, not only has to, I would say, has a mandate to become a self-sufficient country in each segment of these value chain that I just described, but also has to achieve sophistication in each of these to remain competitive. So the problem, the challenge before China is here. Here is to not only become self-sufficient but also remain competitive. And the problem is that achieving specialization in any one segment of the chip value chain is itself highly capital intensive. But to achieve so in each of them is impossible. It is also important to remember that advanced chips are only one of the many core technologies that China aims to become self-sufficient in, right? Given that the Chinese ecosystem is not elaborate as the US and is rather isolated, there are limits to Beijing's potential with its finite resources. As for the US led ecosystem, the costs can be distributed among the participating countries, most of which have much higher per capita income than China. And therefore, to compete with a larger pool of resources which these countries together bring in, China will have to strike a higher success rate on every dime it spends on research, which is difficult to again achieve because breakthroughs in basic research are capital intensive and may not yield success as often. If that alone is not enough for to burden the scientific community in China, the pressure to perform and deliver in China's authoritarian system further compounds the problem. And see how this burdens the tech ecosystem of the Chinese. To sum it up, China's appetite to absorb failures is extremely limited when compared to the US and its allies. This makes for quite an unconducive environment for innovation, in my opinion, given that it thrives best in a free environment. And finally, I would say that the US-led tech ecosystem, because of its widely distributed nature, allows it to source talent from diverse regions. It could rely on especially countries like India, Japan, Taiwan, from Europe, etc. To and because owing to its open immigration policy, and China, on the contrary, will have to solely rely on its national and overseas talent pool at the as the movement of human capital to China becomes even more difficult as the tech contestation between the two countries deepens, right? So these are the major differences that I find in the between the US-led tech ecosystem and the China's isolated or rather isolated Chinese tech ecosystem that will bear on quite heavily as we move forward.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned that in the kind of functional specialization, some of the countries in the American sort of ecosystem have attained. Netherlands is one in producing lithography tools. And as I understand it, the use of lithography tools like deep ultraviolet and extreme ultraviolet have been significant in fabrication of semiconductors. And in Huawei's case in specific, with the use of the 7 nanometer fabrication technique, China has had to rely only on deep ultraviolet lithography and not EUVs, even though the latter is a much more sophisticated means of kind of fabricating the Kirin chipset, or any other semiconductor chipset for that matter. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about how exactly do these differences in the availability of lithography tools affect the Chinese semiconductor ecosystem? And in Huawei's case in specific, what are the nitty-gritties of the tools that have been used, and what are the challenges this can face perhaps when Huawei goes ahead to try to commercialize this?
So, to bring out to gauge how much of a success is Huawei's launch of this new smartphone is. The observers have already claimed that this capability marks a major breakthrough in Beijing's drive to attain self-sufficiency. But I think that while China's technology demonstration deserves appreciation, its self-sufficiency drive faces several hurdles in going ahead, right? So the observers claim that the fact that Chinese succeeded in achieving this feat despite American sanctions on key semiconductor technologies has also exposed the inefficiency of sanctions. But I think there are few. We need to be caution and we need to be cautious in analyzing what this changes and what this development actually means. To begin with, the fabrication technique used by Huawei, SMIC collaboration. It's not still clear if Huawei manufactured it in house using SMIC technology or SMIC fabricated the chipset for Huawei, but whatever. The Kirin 9000S processor is highly inefficient. The wafer yield, it's a metric of efficiency of the chipset. It's how many workable nodes could you produce on the wafer. It measures that capability or the efficiency. And the wafer yield of this, the second generation SMIC technology is way less than 50%. Some even put the figure at around 15%. But if you compare it with the Taiwan's TSMC's 7 nanometer fabrication technique, the wafer yield is in excess of 90%, and even reaching up to 94%. This makes the SMIC's process, which was used to make the Kirin 9000S processors in Huawei's Mate 60 Pro, a highly expensive one. And the companies could take up to 10 times the cost incurred by other competitive players in the market. And this becomes highly uncompetitive for Huawei to remain relevant in the market. Secondly, if you see the 7 nanometer fabrication technique, I would like to give my opinion here and say that there's an agreement among the observers that this 7 nanometer fabrication technique represents the zenith of China's capabilities with the available deep ultraviolet lithography tools, or DUVs. So DUVs and EUVs are two types of lithography tools which are used to fabricate small or advanced chips that are currently in use in the market. The EUVs are the most advanced ones, and DUVs can only help you with fabricating advanced chips up to the size of 10 nanometers. Beyond, if a company wants to progress further and make more sophisticated chips of smaller size, you need to rely on EUVs, right? So, but there are enough reports to suggest that Chinese did not have access to the EUVs after the Americans, Netherlands, the Dutch, and the Japanese came together to ban the sale of EUVs to the Chinese. But the idea is, even because technically DUVs can be used to make these 7 nanometer, or you make these 7 nanometer chipsets. But the process that it would entail would be a highly inefficient one. And according to a tear down done by a Canadian company, it indicates that the Kirin 9000 chipsets, the methodology or the process that Chinese used, that was used to make this chips, was extremely messy and inefficient, and therefore lowering its yield. For instance, the technique used multiple rounds of masking or layering on the wafer to manufacture a 7 nanometer chipset. Because of this, what it did to the chipset was that it increased its exposure to the ultraviolet light. And this makes for a low yield. This adds complexity to the chipset and makes it a very inefficient one. Lastly, it is very doubtful that Huawei SMIC collaboration could produce these current chipsets on a large scale. And why I say so is because of the fact that the US and its allies have now also restricted China's access to even the DUVs lately. And it means that the large scale production of 7 nanometer chips would be a challenge for the Chinese companies. And therefore, coming together, if you bring all these factors together, the low yield rates, inefficient and costly procedures, along with this difficulty in achieving scale, are likely hurdles in Huawei's attempt to commercialize its new technologies. And that's the big worry or the concern that I'm looking at. This is significant because failure to achieve commercialization will impact incremental innovation as they reinforce each other. These two share a direct relationship between the two. And therefore, products such as these fail to innovate. The products that fail to innovate alongside their competition eventually fade away. And that's the biggest worry that uh, I can see with regard to Huawei.
Right. So, Amit, that kind of threefold compounded challenge tells us that even though Huawei has, yes, unveiled this smartphone, and there's a lot of buzz, as you said, about how this kind of circumvents the impact or the perceived impact of American sanctions, the challenges also tell us that. As you rightly put it, that Huawei may find it very difficult in the future to kind of commercialize this technology and put it to large scale. But Huawei isn't just any player, right? It's a serious player. You mentioned that it has lost a lot of market value, but just not enough for it to be eliminated from competitions. And hence that also explains the need to innovate and stay on top of the game, right? So in this context, with this backdrop of the company's seriousness in mind, and this would be my final question to you: why do you think the decision to unveil this smartphone was taken at this point in time? And could it be due to political reasons? Could it be as a snub to the US, or is it really because there is some trick up Huawei's sleeve that we don't know about just yet with regards to the commercialization of this technology? Just your opinions on this.
I'm not quite sure if there was any political play here because I did not see, because the release of Huawei's new model was very quiet, and nobody noticed it until people started buying it and posting it online, right? Huawei did not make an announcement of it or do any pompous celebration that of having achieved a 7 nanometer acing the 7 nanometer fabrication technique. So I don't think I'm not sure if there was any political play here, or it was a message to snub the Americans at the eve of Raimondo's visit. But I still the problem that I see here, if I mean, you said you talked about Huawei being a big player, and I'm not denying it, and I'm not suggesting or indicating in any manner that China or Huawei will not be able to taste successes. Of course, going forward, I mean, despite these challenges and given the kind of resources that the Chinese have and the willingness to put in money, to put in a huge pool of money, I think China will definitely see successes in its self-sufficiency drive. But it may, for me, it may score victory in odd areas, in one or two areas, but replicating this feat in every single domain will be impractical because the China has a daunting challenge of doing everything all by itself without any outside help. And the case is no more similar to what it used to be before 2015 or 2016, wherein or even post the US-China opening up in the 1970s, when the countries were much more accepting and giving to the Chinese. When the Chinese leveraged those that openness and the willingness by from the Western world to invest and share technology with the Chinese, the situation no longer remains the same, and this is a problem that China faces, and this is the nature of this problem makes it quite impractical for the Chinese to come at the top.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Amit. I think it really makes sense to keep both the optimism with regards to, say, China's quest for innovation or its long-term goal to achieve self-reliance at par and in balance with the kind of serious challenges its isolated ecosystem faces. And this achievement in that regard should be contained by the possibility that this is all that Huawei might be capable of revealing and unveiling, and such a technology using only DUVs and the other available equipment might not be sustainable in the long run, or we might see China want to innovate in even developing in-house advanced lithography tools, which will again be a long-term project since China hasn't experimented with this on a large scale in the past. Again, thanks Amit for your insights, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you, Anushka.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.